Elara Foss had worked in the kitchens of Blackthorn Castle for 3 years, and in all that time, no one above her had ever learned her name. She scrubbed pots before sunrise, carried firewood through the long stone halls, and slipped past the guards and nobles like a shadow no one bothered to notice. That was how she liked it. A servant who stayed unseen stayed safe. The castle belonged to Caelan Ashford, the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, a man whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes. He ruled with discipline instead of warmth, and the servants spoke of him only in whispers, careful never to be heard. Elara had seen him from a distance a few times, tall and broad-shouldered, always moving with the same controlled, purposeful stride, as if his whole body obeyed rules his mind had written long ago. Everything changed on the night he returned from the border war. The healers said his wounds were healing badly. His body fought the injuries the way it fought everything else, with stubborn resistance, and his wolf, restless and in pain, refused to settle. The head housekeeper gathered the female servants that evening and announced that one of them would need to attend the king personally until he recovered enough to manage on his own. No one wanted the task. Rumors of his temper were enough to make even the boldest maid step back. They drew straws. Elara lost. She walked to his chambers with a tray trembling slightly in her hands, telling herself it was only nerves about spilling the soup. The truth was simpler and more frightening. She was about to stand in the same room as the most powerful man in the kingdom, and there would be nowhere to hide. The chamber was dim, lit by a single low fire. Caelan sat near the window, his shirt open at the collar, bandages wrapped tightly across his ribs. He looked nothing like the composed ruler from the stories. His jaw was tight with pain, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, and for a moment he looked simply like a man who had been fighting too long. "Leave it on the table," he said, without looking at her. Elara obeyed, setting the tray down carefully. As she reached to steady a shifting bowl, her fingers brushed against his hand. The reaction was instant. Caelan's eyes flashed from human blue to a deep, burning gold, the color of his wolf rising to the surface. He inhaled sharply, and a low sound left his throat, something between a groan and a whine, a sound of pure recognition. His whole body went still, then leaned toward her, as if pulled by an invisible thread. Elara froze, unsure whether to run or stay. "My lord?" He blinked hard, and the gold retreated, leaving only confusion and something close to alarm in his human eyes. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. "You may go." But when she turned to leave, a low growl rumbled from his chest, not aimed at her, but at the distance growing between them. It was not a command from the king. It was something instinctive, something beyond his control. Elara stopped in the doorway, her heart hammering. "Stay," he said, his voice rough, as though the word had been dragged out of him against his will. She stayed. Over the following days, Elara returned each morning and evening to check his bandages and bring his meals. Each time, the same strange pull seemed to happen. His wolf calmed the moment she entered the room, his breathing evened out when she sat nearby, and once, half lost in a fevered sleep, he reached for her wrist and pressed it gently to his cheek, murmuring words she could not understand. Caelan noticed all of it too, and it unsettled him deeply. He was a king who had built his rule on control, on iron discipline over his own instincts, and now his wolf was behaving like an untrained pup around a servant girl he barely knew. He tried distancing himself, giving her fewer tasks, speaking to her with cold formality, but nothing worked. His wolf only grew more restless when she was away, pacing beneath his skin, refusing to be ignored. "Why does this happen?" he finally asked her one evening, more to himself than to her. "Why you?" Elara lowered her eyes, unsure how to answer a question meant for a king to ask no one but himself. "I don't know, my lord. I am only a servant." But that was not entirely true, and she knew it. Her mother had once been part of the pack, a gifted healer with a gentle heart, until she fell in love with a man outside the bloodline the elders approved of. The pack had exiled her for it, stripping away her name and her place among them. Elara had grown up hearing that story like a warning, taught to believe she had no rank, no claim, and certainly no right to be noticed by anyone above her station, least of all a king. She told herself the wolf's reaction meant nothing important, Wolves were unpredictable, she reasoned. Perhaps it was simply her scent, or the herbs she used in his medicine. She repeated this to herself every night, even as her own heart began responding to him in ways she did not want to admit. Word spread quickly through the castle, as it always did. Servants whispered about the strange way the Alpha's wolf behaved around the kitchen girl. Some found it amusing, others found it dangerous. Lady Sera, a noble woman with sharp eyes and sharper ambition, found it intolerable. She had spent years positioning her daughter, Vienne, as the ideal match for the king, arranging meetings, gifts, and careful conversations designed to catch his attention. The idea that a servant, of all people, might be catching his wolf's attention instead was not something she was willing to accept. "A servant cannot become a queen," she said to her daughter one evening, pacing across the parlor with barely restrained anger. "There must be some mistake, some trick. I will not allow her to ruin what we have worked for." She began quietly gathering information, questioning the housekeeper, bribing a young guard for details about the servant girl's background. It did not take her long to learn about Elara's mother and the old exile. It gave her exactly the excuse she needed. "She comes from tainted blood," Lady Sera told the king's advisor the next morning, her voice full of practiced concern. "Her mother broke pack law. Surely the king would not want such history near his throne, especially not before the new moon." The new moon carried old significance among the packs. It was said that any mating bond spoken aloud beneath a new moon sky became unbreakable, sealed by nature itself, rather than by ceremony or law. If the king's wolf truly recognized Elara as his mate, and if that bond were acknowledged before midnight on the new moon, nothing could undo it. Not exile, not politics, not even the king's own doubts. Lady Sera understood this, and it terrified her. The advisor, eager to please a powerful noble family and equally uneasy about the unusual situation, agreed to act. Quiet orders were given. Elara was to be escorted from the castle before nightfall, sent to a distant village under the excuse of family need, far enough away that she would not return before the new moon passed. Elara had no warning. 2 guards arrived at the kitchen entrance that afternoon, informing her she was needed elsewhere and must leave immediately. She did not think to question men in castle uniforms giving orders in the king's name. She gathered her small bag of belongings, confused but obedient, and let herself be led toward the outer gates. Kaelan, meanwhile, sat through a long and tense war council, discussing supply lines and border patrols with his generals. His wolf had been unusually calm that morning, and he had allowed himself to believe, foolishly, that the strange pull toward the servant girl had finally begun to fade. He told himself this was for the best. A king could not build his future on instinct alone. Halfway through the meeting, without warning, his wolf surged forward with a force he had never felt before, clawing at his composure from the inside. Panic, sharp and undeniable, flooded through him, though it was not his own fear, it was hers. He stood so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, startling the generals into silence. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice edged with something dangerously close to desperation. No one understood the question, but something in his expression told them not to ask for clarification. He strode from the room. Following an instinct, he no longer tried to fight, his wolf guiding him through the castle halls with a certainty his human mind could not explain. He found the housekeeper first, who nervously admitted that Elara had been sent away that afternoon by the advisor's order. The moment the words left her mouth, Kaelan's control shattered completely. His wolf tore through his composure, gold flooding his eyes as he broke into a run toward the outer gates, his human form struggling to keep pace with the urgency clawing through him. Elara had just reached the outer courtyard, confused and increasingly uneasy about the strange orders, when she heard her name shouted across the stone yard, raw and desperate, unlike anything she had ever heard from the composed king she had come to know. She turned in time to see him running toward her, his control visibly slipping, his shoulders trembling as his wolf pushed against the boundary of his human shape. Guards and nobles gathered nearby froze in shock. No one had ever seen the Alpha King lose command of himself in public. He reached her breathless, his eyes still gold, his voice raw. "Don't go. My lord, I don't understand." I know, he said, cutting her off gently. I didn't understand either. I fought it because I was afraid of what it meant, afraid of losing control over something I could not command. But my wolf knew you before I allowed myself to see it. He recognized you the very first night, and I was too proud, too stubborn, to admit what that meant. The courtyard fell silent, every servant and noble watching as the powerful Alpha King knelt before a kitchen servant in the open evening air, moments before the new moon would rise fully over the castle walls. I am not asking you to serve me, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I am asking you to stand beside me, if you are willing, not because my wolf demands it, but because I am finally choosing it with my own heart. Tears gathered in Elara's eyes, disbelief and hope tangled together. They told me my blood was tainted, that I could never belong here. Blood does not decide who deserves love, Kaelan said firmly. My wolf never cared about bloodlines or titles. He cared about you, and now neither do I. He tilted his head back, baring his throat before her, an act of complete submission that no alpha offered lightly. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. It was the deepest form of surrender a wolf could give, proof that his claim was not about ownership, but about honoring her as his equal. Elara reached out, her trembling hand resting gently against his throat, accepting what his wolf had known from the very beginning. The moment their bond was spoken aloud beneath the rising new moon, a warmth spread through the courtyard, felt by every shifter present, sealing the connection between them beyond any doubt. Lady Sarah's scheme unraveled swiftly in the days that followed. The advisor, fearing the king's anger, confessed everything, and Lady Sarah's plans crumbled under the weight of her own ambition. The old exile placed upon Elara's mother was reviewed and overturned by the king's own decree, her name restored to the pack she had once been forced to leave. Weeks later, Elara stood beside Kaelan on the highest balcony of Blackthorn Castle, watching the pack gather below under a clear night sky. She was no longer invisible, no longer a servant passing unseen through stone hallways. She was seen, fully and completely, by the one person whose wolf had recognized her worth before his own mind allowed him to. As the pack below raised their voices together in a long, joyful howl, welcoming their new queen, Kaelan turned to her with a soft, genuine smile, the kind she had never once seen from the distant, disciplined king she used to know from afar. I almost let pride cost me everything, he admitted quietly. Elara smiled back, leaning into him without hesitation. Your wolf never gave up on me. That was enough. Together, they watched the moon settle fully into the night sky, its light no longer a symbol of fear or urgency, but of a bond finally allowed to shine without shadow, a beginning neither of them would ever take for granted again.